Have you seen the film Slumdog Millionaire? Do you recall the young fake tour guides, Jamal and Salim, lifting shoes from outside Taj Mahal in the story? Do you know what economic concept that sequence tells us about? My guest today is Professor Sudipta Sarangi. He's a professor of economics at Virginia Tech, where one of the courses he takes is called Economic Puzzles in History, Literature, and Movies. I spoke to him about the book that he has just published. It's called The Economics of Small Things, and in which he identifies serious economic behavior in everyday life and explains the concepts at work, and in doing so, he tries to show economics can be fun. One of these he illustrates using the shoe story from Slumdog Millionaire. Professor Sarangi, welcome to Everyday Economics. Thank you for taking out time.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to this. I've never done a podcast before, so it's going to be thrilling doing this with you.
Terrific. Let me congratulate you on your book, The Economics of Small Things, about which we are going to talk today. And what I plan to do is to ask you to talk about the illustrations of microeconomics concepts that you've written about. Many of these are, in fact, daily occurrences for many of us in our everyday lives. And you're essentially saying that what we do is, in fact, we practice microeconomics without even knowing that we do.
In some ways, yes, you can argue that. In fact, that's the whole point was that economic phenomena are all around us. It's just that if we take a step back, we can see them. Because in a way, economists are philosophers. We try to explain what human behavior is about and what we're doing. So this is kind of the message of this book, to make it easy for everyone to see this phenomena around them.
If you could, before I start, if you could say a little bit about the difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics, because most people, when they think about economics, the image, that they have is about central banks and interest rates and inflation and government spending and things like that, public finance, maybe even banking. So how microeconomics is different from all of that?
Oh, it's an excellent question. And I mean, this perception is quite common. Whenever I'm flying on an airplane, every now and then somebody sitting next to me will ask me what I do, and they'll tell me, "Oh, so you must know how to play the stock market." And then I have to tell them, no, not really. Economists don't know anything about the stock market. And then I sort of try and tell them that, that's finance, people who understand the stock market. So macro, as the name says, is economy-wide phenomena. That's things happening on a bigger scale. But micro, on the other hand, is what is happening at the small scale, how little things matter. So you might say that if you look at things under a microscope, what you see is microphenomena. And then if you aggregate this microphenomena, you see what we get at the macro level. So just let me give you an example, right? So one of the most interesting examples was the introduction of the seat belt. It was thought that, okay, so seat belt would be safe for people, so it will reduce casualties. Let's introduce seat belts. What happened after the introduction of seat belts was something very interesting. That is, the number of accidents did not really change. However, driver casualty went down and pedestrian casualty went up. Why? Because the drivers who had the seat belts now felt more comfortable and safer, so they would take more risks while driving and end up hitting more pedestrians. In other words, this is the micro aspect of behavior that drives what happens on a global scale. So, somebody may want to buy something, somebody may not want to sell something, right? So these are the little things that drive macro phenomena. Another example, we say a very important foundation of behavior is diminishing marginal utility. So the first glass of water, it makes you happier. The second glass of water, if you're very thirsty, you may want it, but it doesn't make you as happy. By the time you reach the third or fourth glass of water, you surely don't want to drink. Which means if I'm thinking about, forget water, if I'm thinking about pizza slices, you're willing to pay most for the first slice of pizza, a little bit less for the second slice of pizza, and so on. That's why we have a downward sloping demand curve. So this is how microphenomena explain macrophenomena. That's the difference.
Let's start talking about your book with the example that you give, the example of pens. pens people carry in their pockets, you write, tell us about signaling economics. You say that pens in a country like India have tremendous signaling value.
Yes. So first, the book talks about a person, or at least in the introduction, I talk about somebody who never leaves his house without a fountain pen in his pocket. I just want people to know this is actually a true story. So if you go to IIT Bombay, you should be able to identify this person. Okay, now I grew up in pre-liberalization India, and in pre-liberalization India, fountain pens were sort of a symbol of status. They were very, very important. So students could only afford, these Chinese makes, Hero and Wing Sun and things like that. And of course, there was always Mont Blanc, there was always Parker and Schaefer and all these, Waterman. These were the really well-known pens. And it was a pride to have this. But if you think about it, what did the pen signify? In my opinion, the pen was kind of, if you borrow the phrase, the pen is mightier than the sword, the pen signified education. The pen signified erudition. In an economy where there is a scarcity of jobs and education is highly valued, I think being able to carry a pen tells people that you have education. And this relates to signaling. So signaling is an idea put forward by Michael Spence, who said that imagine that there is a pool of workers and you do not really know the ability of these workers, right? So some of them could be high ability, some of them could be low ability. So the workers, of course, you can always try to screen them by designing tests. On the other hand, the workers could also try to do something to persuade you that they are good workers. So what might the workers do? The workers might go and get themselves some education to convey to you that they are good workers and they are high ability workers. In fact, what is interesting, or what is one of the prerequisites, is that whatever the activity you use to signal your abilities should be costly. For example, if everybody could signal that they are high ability just by jumping up and down, then everybody, high ability and low ability people, will mimic each other, right? On the other hand, if you say, look, I can go to IIT to signal that I'm high ability, or Delhi School of Economics to signal I'm high ability, that's a different story, right? Because not everybody is able to do that. So the object with which you signal should be expensive. Second, it actually does not have to convey or does not have to do even with the job, right? So I may hire somebody with a degree from a particular institution, even if it does not relate to the job on hand, which is why many people get an engineering degree and they end up becoming managers. It's just a matter of ability. So that's the first thing you want to think about. So the pen, basically, I will argue that at that time in India did that. So you could say, okay, why does a person who did not have very high education carry a pen? Well, they could, but as soon as you started talking to them, you would figure out that this is not a person with high ability. Now, today, of course, it's not so clear that the pen remains a device of signaling because the smartphone does many of these things. And there are cheap ballpoint pens or the Biro. But I think today it has, as you know, Vivek Devroy, by the way, has a fantastic essay on this. You should read his book on the fountain pen. It's an amazing read.
I have.
It's an amazing read. I loved it.
Yes.
So that's where it goes.
So, why I was actually interested in talking about this particular illustration from your book is because a lot of times people don't understand that, there is something called a price signal. And we encounter this, for instance, when we talk about, minimum support prices in Indian agriculture, and the whole concept of price signals. Many of my listeners probably would like to understand, that's something that doesn't come so naturally to non-economists.
So that actually is a very good point, because one of the things that the government does or can do is to provide signals to the private market, right? So let me start with a slightly different example, then I come to. So what does the IMF do? the IMF, by willing to lend money to a country, IMF is kind of the international lender of last resort. When the IMF is willing to lend money to a country with certain conditionalities, it is a signal to private lenders to say that, look, this country has the confidence of IMF. It is possibly on the road to recovery. So we should consider lending it money. Okay? This is the idea of a signal that you say something. So we have an event about which the common people, or let's say the economic agents out there, don't know much. If somebody like a government comes in and makes a statement, that reveals information to everybody else. So that's what a price signal does, right? So if the government comes and sets a price signal, okay, or a certain price, then what they're saying is that we expect that this is a reasonably fair price for the farmers. It should not go below these things. That's why we also have ideas like minimum support, what is MRP, right?
Yes.
Of course, nowadays search costs have changed. You could ask what is the logic behind MRPs. That's a different story, because the idea behind, one way to think about the idea behind MRP was that, if we have a firm that has very low cost of production that could kind of outwit everyone else. So if you establish a minimum, then all the firms would do reasonably well. But then search costs actually take the logic of that away now. So I hope that kind of explains why price signals are important. It provides information to everybody else
Right.
about
So,
what to expect in the market.
right. So what you're saying is that the minimum support price for farm produce, for instance, has a dual function. Not only that the government will procure at that price, but it is also a signal to the rest of the market, and that itself helps setting of the market price, which is a different price than the minimum support price.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So those two things sometimes people don't understand. But I want to
Yeah,
take this.
I think it's very important. I mean, the same thing, the MRP, MSP, these all, by providing this, you're providing a benchmark. So the government signal is a benchmark around which you can figure out, because it's a serious area of research. How to determine price, what is value, how to determine price, right? So we need to have, if somebody who we consider trustworthy comes in and sets a benchmark, then the market can actually figure out what to do around that. So that's why it's a price signal.
Right. Yeah.
So it is definitely still a signal, but now it is a signal not of education. It is a signal of status. It's like now we have this conspicuous consumption. So this relates to the idea of Thorstein Veblen, who talked about this idea of status goods, keeping
Yeah.
up with the Joneses or keeping up with the Singhs, as I would say in India.
And in certain, let's say, circles, it would actually be seen as as a symbol, as a signal of decadence.
Yes, I guess so. I guess so because
And that is the whole concept you talk about, heterogeneity.
the real issue of heterogeneity is that one area where heterogeneity becomes very important is the idea of price discrimination, right?
Yeah.
So somebody may be willing to pay more for a product, and somebody may not be willing to pay more for the same price for that product. So what do firms do? What they do is they introduce different versions. We know this. The simplest example was, if you want to catch a flight, then you can have something like the business class or the first class. That's a little better service, a little more comfort at a higher price. And then you have economy, which is a little less comfort at a lower price. And since firms don't know which consumer is willing to pay what, they offer these two products so people with different tastes can separate themselves out.
But I suspect these days with online sales, sometimes I wonder, if I am bumped off a flight just because at the last minute somebody else has offered to pay more for that seat, which I actually booked long time back. But, I didn't report 3 hours in advance, and then the flight, the airline uses that as an excuse to tell me that I've been offloaded. So
Yes.
they're actually they're willing. They're able to charge two different flyers, two different prices for the same seat. They're able to discriminate against me on the same seat.
Yes, so that is true. I'm not sure how legal that is, though. One should look into the legality of these aspects. But if it is a binding rule that if you don't report 3 hours in advance, they can do this, then I guess they can do this. But the whole idea of price discrimination is about willingness. Who is willing to pay what, right? So if at different points in time you are willing to pay different prices for the same product, right?
True.
Then they could, right? So, for example, you were going to, Goa on a vacation, but it also turns out that your business partner is going to show up there, right? And you could
True.
strike a potential deal. Then you would now be willing to pay more for that ticket than you were paying before. So, because now you've got the vacation, plus you have the potential ability to strike a very big deal. So you
So,
take those
so
two
how
into
you,
account.
yeah, so how you value that seat, it's just your calculation changes.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, that is why this name your own price type of stuff has been started, right? So many of these
Mhm.
airlines now, they will say, okay, you booked in economy class, but you can put a bid on a business class ticket. And this is very interesting for two reasons. One, the company now knows what you are willing to pay for a business class ticket. Okay. Over time, imagine they have data on this from hundreds of customers. They can now start to see a demand curve for business class tickets that they did not have. So while you may or may not get the business class seat, by revealing what you're willing to pay for it, you are helping the firm to compute the demand curve and do their pricing better in the future. I mean, in a way, it's a win-win because if you get it, you are paying the price you would have liked to pay. So the firm has fully managed to price discriminate, and they also gained the data, and you're also happy.
Right. Um, let's talk about the chapter on Gandhiji, which brings out something that critics of economics and economists always keep talking about, which is that economics needs to specifically design policy tools for fairness and social justice. It's not a given in the logic of economics.
Yes, I think that's an unfair critique of economics because if you look at the notion of economics, as I said, economists, you can think of them as philosophers who are trying to explain human phenomena. In other words, economics is a positive science. It tries to explain phenomena, it does not take sides. So when economists take sides, that is usually when they put on the policy hat. And I don't know if you know how common this joke is. There is a joke that if you put 12 economists in the room, there'll be 13 opinions because Keynes will have two opinions about everything. So, you know, I think it's absolutely true that economics does not think about this policy side of social justice and so on. It just tries to do study the situation. Having said that, I want to make two other observations. Not focusing on inequality and fairness and so on, I think, is not entirely true. Economists from places like India, developing countries, have always focused on issues of inequality and fairness. So there's a long tradition within economics. If you see, maybe the advanced countries, OECD countries, and places like the US, inequality and fairness were not a big deal till recent years, right? Because inequality has grown all over the world. Especially after Thomas Piketty's Capital, it has become a serious issue everywhere. But I think developing countries always thought about this. Then this whole tradition of social choice, which is the idea of how do you devise fair rules to allocate wealth, right? I mean, there is Amartya Sen, there is Prasanta Patnaik. This whole group actually, it was back in Delhi school in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. These were big developments and big advancements were made there. So economists do care about that, but policies which implement these ideas are not just done by economists. There's policymakers, there's politicians, whole bunch of people. There is political feasibility. A lot of things determine what we can actually do.
Yeah, and your chapter on Gandhiji.
Oh, so the chapter on Gandhiji, yes, I'm so sorry, I forgot. The chapter on Gandhiji actually talks about price discrimination in a certain way. It talks about first. I wanted to show that there is a lot of revisionist history, and people don't people say all kinds of things about Gandhi right now. And in some ways, you can say he has fallen off the pedestal a little bit. And maybe there are things we can quibble about. But in some ways, Gandhi has given to India and the world certain things that nobody can take away. To show the importance of nonviolence as a form of protest, I think that is very important. The other thing I wanted to make a point was, when he came back to India to understand India, he traveled throughout India in third class trains. Right? So there are very few politicians today who would be willing to understand their own country anywhere in the world by traveling for a year using trains and that to third class. Right? So that's the point I wanted to make. But then Gandhi complained, as you correctly pointed out, that, well, what is this? I mean, this third class is so much worse than first class. It's really awful. And here you want to understand the power of microeconomic theory. The reason third class is so much worse than first class is not because the firm doesn't care. It's not because the firm wants to make the people who are traveling in third class feel bad. The problem is you don't want the guy who's willing to pay for the first class ticket pay for the third class. If you make third class very comfortable, what will this person do? They will say, well, why do I need to go by first class? I'll just go to third class. So there has to be a significant difference between these classes if we want people to pay for the price. The technical term for this is called the single crossing over property. But the idea is if you want the first class passenger to pay for first class prices and third class passenger to pay for the third class prices, then you do not want the quality and comfort between those two products. It does not have to be about plane tickets. It can be about the quality of a product also, right? So it could be, you don't want a shaving blade with three Mach 3 versus the one with 5. They have to have different quality, right? So that's the point I wanted to make, that it's not that the firm is out to discriminate against the economy passenger or the passenger that is traveling in third class by train. It's just to make sure that the first class passenger is willing to pay those prices and help the firm make more profits.
So the first class passenger must feel sufficiently satisfied paying that kind of money. And one of the things about human beings is that they will feel like paying more if they feel they're getting more in return for what they've paid. And it's kind of they will feel that if they see not only what they're getting, but also they're able to compare it with what somebody in the second class or the third class is getting.
Yes,
So
yes.
essentially it's
Yes.
that.
So value for money, right? You
Yeah.
hit it on the head. Value for money, and then of course we tend to do this relative comparison, right? So we will
Yeah,
look
it's not
over and
just
see.
what I'm getting, but it's also what who paid less than me is getting. Is
Yes,
there a
yes, exactly,
yeah,
exactly, right?
I mean, I myself often used to, I haven't traveled in trains for a long time now, but as a junior reporter, I have done fair bit of traveling by trains, and I used to always tell all my friends that I don't understand. I can understand the amount of space they give you in a first class ticket versus a AC ticket, space, because the more number of passengers can be put in space. I understand that completely. But what I don't understand is the amount of padding they put on the first class berth versus the second class AC berth. Because they're buying in so much bulk, there's not going to be much difference between the cost of that, mattress padding on seats. But obviously they do this because they want the first class passenger to feel that, second class travel is not as comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, you want to give that red carpet, right? So you want to feel
Yeah.
like, you are really special.
So,
Otherwise,
so
why will I do that? Why will I be willing to pay all that price if you don't make me feel
yeah,
special somehow?
I don't know if they still do it, but there was a time when, for first class passengers, they used to give rose baths.
Oh my
Which
God. No,
you don't really, oh, you don't know this? I don't think you really need rosebuds when you're traveling by train. But Indian Railways, they used to give these single stem rosebuds
Rosebuds, yeah.
with a kind of a leaf tied around it. It is hilarious. Why do you need it?
Yeah.
It makes no difference to your journey.
Yeah, it makes no difference.
But
But as you said, it's just to make you feel special, right? So you can show off the rosebud, and it has two effects actually, right? Because one, you are feeling special. Next, when you do something like this, the other person who's paid a lesser ticket, a lesser price, and is traveling on a lesser class, feels like, again, it's a signal value, you could argue. You could say, maybe I like that, they're being treated so special. Maybe next time I'll pay the higher price and travel. I want to get that experience. So it's also a little bit of a marketing gimmick to do these. These are signals that are visible, that are publicly and easily visible, that everybody can see.
Right. And since we are talking about, price discrimination, let's talk about also the other chapter in your book, which is about prejudice and biases. And you explain the difference between statistics-based discrimination and taste-based discrimination. Could you explain these concepts, please?
Yes. So let me start with taste-based discrimination. That's very simple. I don't like broccoli. Okay? I hate broccoli. So if you give me any dish with broccoli in it, I will never eat that. I'll prefer anything else over broccoli. So taste-based discrimination, as the name says, it's about our own tastes. And this is the kind of thing you can use to explain white supremacists and neo-Nazis. So these are people who don't like some other people simply because of the color of their skin. Or you could say, I don't like somebody because of their religion. This is purely taste-based, okay? And it has nothing to do with any other logic. So this is the phenomenon that I cannot defend. Now, statistical discrimination is a very interesting idea. What it says is when I'm presented with lots of information, one simple way our brain processes that information is to create a stereotype. Okay, so imagine that a lot of black men are incarcerated in the US. Okay, or imagine that in our modern times, many people who undertake terrorist activities are from the Middle East. Okay, not everybody, but the probability it will be high. It's from somebody from the Middle East it's higher. So when the common man sees, or when the airport person screening people sees, in their head, what do? They use a heuristic, okay? Instead of trying to process every single bit about every single passenger. And it's very normal for us to do that. We just think, well, we know that a person from a Middle East origin can have this, or a person from, with a certain skin color has more likely to be engaged in a certain type of crime. So or a person from a certain caste is more likely to be less educated. So our brain automatically puts in this bias and discriminates against them because of the statistics that stacked up against them. So that is statistical discrimination. And now I'm not saying that it is good. I'm not trying to explain what the causes of statistical discrimination are. And they are serious causes. That goes back to inequality and oppression and other kinds of problems. But that's what statistical discrimination is. There is a logic driving that. Taste-based discrimination is purely taste.
Right, and that helps us with economic concepts.
Yes. I'm not. I didn't follow the question there. I'm sorry.
Puja. So I'm saying, how do you use these insights? How do you use them in your microeconomics concepts?
Okay. So statistical discrimination is something we can be aware of. You can inform people, right? So for example, there is sensitivity training, right? You can make people aware that we tend to do these stereotypes, and we can address this. Police officers can be trained, airport screeners can be trained, that please don't treat everybody like this. It may be in terms of probabilities these happen, but don't treat everybody equal. The world is heterogeneous. And so we can address that. Um, but taste-based discrimination, there is just nothing we can. I mean, these are people that are hateful in some ways, and the only way I think, and that's what I say in the chapter also, the only way to do this, to fight taste-based discrimination, is by creating awareness, is by creating better education, and is by educating the youth today about the future tomorrow, and to explain to them that, I mean, why would you discriminate against somebody because of their skin color or their religion? We are all the same people, you know.
Right, right.
We have the same blood and we suffer from the same diseases like COVID. COVID, is a great leveler. It attacks everybody the same. I mean, lower income people maybe more.
Right.
So education and awareness.
Right. And one of the examples that you give in this chapter is of the white sounding names versus the non white sounding names on resumes, and how that can change the frequency of callbacks for job interviews. And you also have an example from India, which is an experiment, I think, which was done by Professor Abhijit Banerjee. But that, if you could talk a little about that, and that leads me into my question, which I sort of told you about earlier too, is that since we're talking about names and how that triggers certain behaviors, why is it that in India dogs always get named like Brutus and Caesar, but horses are always Tufan and Badal and Chetak, all Indian names?
Yes. So I think, I like that question a lot. I'll come to that, but let me talk
I
about
was
this.
worried that you will say that I'm trivializing
No,
microeconomics.
no. I think Shakespeare said that, what's in a name, a rose by any other name is still a rose. I think that's not true. So I'll give you some examples, and then I'll talk about that. But first, let me talk about this experiment. So
Yeah.
the experiment that was done in Boston was that they sent out two identical fictitious resumes, and one was called Emily and Justin, and the other one was called Jamal and Lakeisha. And they found out, so Jamal and Lakeisha are very African American sounding names. And obviously the other two are very white sounding names. And then what they found out that the response or the callback rates for these names were very different for Jamal and Lakeisha. They were much lower. Okay? And so, and this happens without even people, maybe we're not saying that this is necessarily taste-based discrimination. But obviously, somehow there could be taste-based discrimination, but there is always already a prejudice you see built into this, right? So, and the paper was, I think, is X and Y more employable than A and B or something like that. So, the same thing was done in India by Abhijit Banerjee and some of his co-authors, and they were, of course, in India. It's about caste, so they were interested in looking at whether caste makes a difference and religion makes a difference, and they focused on the software sector. And this was, of course, a few years ago. I think the whole world is becoming more polarized. I don't know if the experiment replicated today would give the same results, but back then, certainly there was no caste prejudice. So at least urban, educated India does not seem to have these prejudices.
Yeah, this
That's
was
a
done
great
in
thing.
Delhi and around Delhi, this particular experiment. And
Exactly right.
Indian outcomes of this result were in contrast with those done in the US. They couldn't
Yes.
detect much discrimination in India
Yeah.
back then.
And I think that's a very good thing. I mean, that
Yeah.
reading that paper, even though you could say that in terms of science, that is, you don't find anything. So many times people say, oh, you don't have a result. So why is that an interesting paper? I think when you contrast that to what you find in a society that is polarized along racial lines, it's very uplifting. And I hope that trend is still continuing in India.
Yeah.
So now to go back to your question about names. Okay, so let me tell people that there was an episode in Freakonomics where Steve Levitt and other researchers, they tracked how names trickle down. So names that are used by the upper classes in one generation take a little bit of time, but suddenly those names become popular in the lower socioeconomic status. Okay,
Yes.
you see a difference of, I don't remember, maybe one generation or about 10, 15 years, and you see this cycle of names. So what is going on here is that people want to emulate the rich and the famous and the celebrities. Okay, so names do matter. Names, again, I think they go back to saying that names are a signal of abilities. Names are a branding exercise. So, in fact, I have a friend who owns a firm, and he was telling me that there are companies that actually exist for the single purpose of providing your company a name. Right. So you actually pay a fee to figure out what should be the optimal name for your firm. What's the best name for your firm? So what do the names do? The names actually provide you with a brand. They make you happy. They tell you how you visualize your product and how you want to visualize or how you want others to see your product. That's the important function they serve. And all those names that you talked about for horses, if you look at them, they all have one thing in common. That is, they seem to signify motion and movement. Okay, and if you think about the names of the dogs, I will first hazard a guess that those are usually large dogs. Small dogs, I don't think
Yeah.
usually have these kinds of. So the large dogs, you want to have a sense of aggression, and so this is my personal experience. If we look at Indian mythology or sort of Indian history, we don't have names of very many aggressors with that kind of ring to it, right? So I was doing some things. So I wouldn't call my dog Rana Pratap. I mean, that doesn't really sound like a dog name. Whereas Brutus kind of fits, or Caesar kind of fits.
You'll also have protesters outside wanting to bring down your doors.
Yes. No, so, our dog is called Duffley, for instance, right? So because we decided that Duffley is there's Rishi Kapoor and then Dylan singing "Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man," and then my wife was joking that we'll be called Duffley Wales Mein. So we have a small dog. So I think names do have a purpose, and the horse names, and I was thinking about this globally. Horse names globally actually tend to convey a sense of speed and motion and things like that, and they're usually, I will say, more I don't know, more fascinating than dog names. Dog names are more
Yeah.
about person or a
Yeah.
character.
Yeah, because I guess, they're your pets, they're your friends, family members, whereas horses tend to be, into racing or for other purposes. They're not sort of, snuggling into you
Yeah,
at
yeah,
home.
that's
So
a very good
probably it's
point.
something like that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, difference that horses are not pets.
Yeah. I mean, even when they'll be on the farm, they're not going to be sort of under your study table.
Yes.
Try. The very interesting chapters in your book are about, which everybody will identify with, are the ones on the Alfonso mangoes and the shoe pinchers, which both explain economic concepts very well. Those two things that we see around us.
Yeah, so I'll start with the shoe theft story, right? So my idea with the shoe theft story was to illustrate the fact that certain things are complements, like chai and chacha, or chai and matri, or chai and mari biscuit, or the left shoe and the right shoe. So in fact, I talk about this example from the town of Malmo in Sweden, and Malmo, incidentally, is the town where Kurt Wallander operates, right? So the Henning Mankell detective, if you've seen either the Swedish version or the one with what's his name, the British actor who did all Kenneth Branagh. So that's the town of Malmo. So they found that the thieves were breaking into store windows and stealing shoes from the store windows. These are designer shoes. But interestingly, there was only one shoe, like left shoe. So the cops were very puzzled. Why would somebody steal one out of a pair of shoes? What do you do? Because if you don't have the other pair, you can't use the shoe. Turns out Malmo is a border town. So across the border in Denmark, store windows display the right shoes. So these guys were trans-border thieves, where they were breaking into store windows in Sweden and Denmark, putting pairs together and selling them. Right. So this is a very important thing because it's like saying certain things work well in complements. Imagine you bought 10 right shoes and 5 left shoes. What's the use of the additional 5 right shoes? You can't put them to any use. You will pair 5 right shoes with 5 left shoes, but the remaining 5 right shoes are absolutely useless. Or is it by saying if I have, if I have 5 typewriters or 5 computer consoles and I hire 20 people to work on them, again, it's useless. So complementarity is very, very important. That's the idea. And of course, I think we talk about a chappal chori in there. And that is, what do you do if you go to a temple? And the solution I remember suggested to me long ago by Kaushik Basu when I used to hitch a ride from him occasionally when I was a student at Delhi school. And there are several solutions. A simple solution is to put the left shoe and the right shoe far away from each other. Of course, another one I thought you could do if you have the guts to do this is wear 2 different pairs of shoes, right? So the left shoe from one pair and the right shoe from another pair and go to the temple. You can put them in the same cubbyhole, or just wear, your old chappals so that if somebody steals, what do you care? Of course, there is the metaphysical question of who dares to steal from a temple, right? Because Bhagwan, you are at the house of the Lord and you're willing to steal from there. That should be scary. And then, of course, there's this other question of do you inherit the sins of the person whose shoes you stole? So complementarity matters, and there is a very important part.
To your question, I'd say that it's possible that the thief, the shoe pincher, is thinking that, well, I need the shoe more than the person who owns it needs it, and he's in any case here, because of faith. And if he really needs the shoe, then God will make sure he gets another pair or something like that. Who knows? Maybe
yes.
Are they even thinking?
That's So, that's the interesting part about philosophical discussions, because you talk about justifications, and there are people who have said that, right? So I've encountered many people who've told me, well, if it was stolen from a temple, maybe that was God's will. Maybe that person needs that shoe more than me.
Yeah.
Exactly what you said. I mean, I think that can be defended, and there are people who believe that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say, I'll take 1 minute to talk about the Oring theory.
Yeah. Very important.
Yeah. So the Oring theory argues that when there is complementarity in a production process, the simplest example that everyone today knows about is supply chain. Okay. If a small minor component fails, the entire supply chain goes up in smoke. Like during COVID times, if one small, we're talking about vaccination, right? If we don't have disposable syringes, even if we manufacture all the vaccines, if we don't have places to store them, these are all complementary inputs, and not enough attention is being paid globally to these issues, especially in developing countries. That do we have enough disposable syringes? So the reason it is called the Oring theory is that in the Space Shuttle Challenger, this very small gasket-like thing called an O-ring failed. And because of that, the entire space shuttle blew up. This was an idea put forward by Michael Kremer, who got the Nobel Prize along with Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo last year in an early paper in 1993. It's a brilliant idea, but as I said, it's just this idea of it applies everywhere, including COVID vaccines. So I just wanted to bring that forward. So that's why complementarity is very important, and understanding complementarity is very important.
Probably it applies in macroeconomics too. I mean, you can have the best central bank and the best inflation targeting system, framework, theory-wise, but when your data is so poor as it is in India, all your best systems sort of are not going to be able to deliver because the quality of your data is not good.
Yes, no, I think, yeah. So I think in any kind of policy making, these are very important things, and, garbage in is garbage out. So if you are basing your policy on a complementary input, like bad data, then you're not going to achieve anything. So I completely agree with this. So having the right kind of information is, in many situations, a very important part of the sort of your final output.
Yes, and your we'll talk about your Alfonso and
Oh, the
mangoes example, and then we'll go to game theory, which is something I just don't understand. So please explain.
Alright. So the Alfonso mango example is very simple. Okay, people. So this just does not necessarily only about Alfonso mangoes. You can talk about chai in Assam. You can talk about the fact that the whole Janpat market, when I was a student, used to be based on the fact of selling what they called rejects, because
Hmm.
those who used to sell T-shirts on Janpat would say that, this is. I mean, you would say Gap, and they would tell you, no, no, this is not original Gap. The original is already sent to the US. This is the reject. So what's the idea there? The idea is that if you do a relative cost analysis, the the Indian consumer can get much more of another mango than they can get for the Alfonso. Okay, so the for spend by spending the same amount of money, they can get more of another mango, like say maybe Daseri or Langda or Malda or whatever, compared to Alfonso. So, in relative terms, Alfonso is more expensive for the Indian consumer than the consumer abroad. And the same argument applies to tea in Assam. So you could buy the expensive price, but you have cheaper options available. So the relative price is very high, which is why it leads to these things being exported. I mean, I would have to do more with numbers, but the intuitive explanation is that the relative price is different for different groups, which is why the best products tend to be exported outside, because the second best and the third best are available to you. And
Right.
that changes the relative price.
Right. And so what is game theory? What is the Nash equilibrium that everybody's seen, in the Russell Crowe film, A Beautiful Mind? What are the examples of these in real life? And your book, of course, gives examples of how game theory could be put to use in global trade wars and even political negotiations. But also, you develop it further and you tell us about, how it can be used to understand the whole Pehle Aap folklore about the Lucknowi Nawabs. And by the way,
Right.
what outcome does game theory predict for the farmer Modi government differences, talks, and negotiations that are going on right now?
Oh, all right. That's a lot of questions. If I forget to get to some of them, you should ask me. So let me start. What is game theory? Game theory says it's a rule governed situation. Okay, so the set of rules is specified, the set of players or who are playing this game is specified, what actions they can take is specified, and what are the outcomes associated with these actions is specified, and then we look for what behaviors are stable. I want to make a caveat here. These things are specified. They don't always have to be known with certainty. So we can say that, I don't know, maybe this person may get a high payoff or a low payoff. So we don't have to know the outcomes with certainty. The outcomes can be uncertain. Okay, but as long as we know the distribution or the probabilities associated with different outcomes, they can be modeled. So once we have these ideas well defined, then we try to think of how to look for what will happen in this game. And one of the outcomes that we look for is called a Nash equilibrium, named after John Nash Jr., who invented this idea. So let me give you a to start with, let me give you a very simple example. Let's talk about prisoner's dilemma. So the idea, prisoner's dilemma, the Nash equilibrium is very easy to find because it has what we call a dominant strategy. So there are two prisoners. They are put in two different cells, and the cops go and ask them, "Okay, did you commit the crime?" And the deal is, if the other person is not confessing to the crime, you should confess because you will get to turn state witness and you go free. So no prison sentence for you. Okay.
Mhm.
And if you both confess, of course, you both go to prison, and nobody confesses, there is not enough evidence. So then you sit and say, okay, should I confess or should I not? And you realize, well, if the other person is not confessing, I should confess because then I get to become state witness. What if the other person is confessing? you should still confess, because otherwise you will end up in prison for a long time. So no matter what the other person is doing, you confess. Let me give you another example: the beauty industry. Okay, the beauty industry, I will argue, has persuaded people all over the world that they need to use beauty products. Why? Because you ask yourself, well, if the other person is not using a beauty product, let me use it because it helps me. And then you also say, if the other person is using a cosmetic product, let me use it because otherwise I'm being left behind. So no matter what happens, everyone uses beauty product. So what's a Nash equilibrium? A Nash equilibrium is a situation from which nobody wishes to deviate unilaterally. In other words, if the other person is doing what they are doing, you don't want to deviate from that. Okay? Let me give you another very simple example. Suppose I have a game about choosing to drive on the left side of the road or choosing to drive on the right side of the road. You can easily imagine what will happen if some people are driving on the left, some people are driving on the right. Total chaos. If everybody drives on the left, do you wish to deviate from that? Individually? No. If all the people in your country are driving on the left, do you want to be the one that's driving on the right? No.
Unless you're
That's an
Indian.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know, because I've seen, yes, we have both seen that on exits, right? If the exit is far away, people do that. Uh,
I'm
but
so
they're trying,
sorry.
that's because the game doesn't cover the cost of petrol, really. But the idea is that, a Nash equilibrium is one from which, if everybody else is doing that, you don't want to be the one that deviates. So everybody driving on the left, everybody driving on the right are two different Nash equilibria. These are two
Yeah.
different Nash equilibria, and nobody wishes to deviate. So that's an example of a coordination game. These are very important for policy. For example, you might need the government to signal something for people to be coordinated on one of the two equilibria, which is why we have rules and laws. One function that a law does is to tell people, look, you must all drive on the left. Otherwise, there would be complete chaos. In a game where there are multiple equilibria, it's very useful to have somebody who will come and set policy. The other game, of course, that is becoming very important is the game of chicken, right? So the game of chicken, the way I want to think about the game of chicken is it's a game where reputation is more important than dying. You know, so izzat is everything that matters. You don't want to give that up. So imagine the following situation: two people sit in front of each other and they decide, I'm going to hold my breath. The first one to stop holding their breath is the loser. Of course, if they keep holding the breath forever, they're both going to die, right? So the first one to stop holding the breath is the loser, and the other person is the winner. That's the game of chicken. You can easily imagine in this polarized world, Trump and Kim Jong-un, Trump and Xi Jinping, right? What is going on? Neither of them wants to seem weak in their own country, even if it means that there is going to be problems in the trade war, right? Even if people are going to suffer, it's all about reputation. I mean, same thing why countries often end up having fights. Soldiers are the ones who pay the price maybe when there is war between two countries, but the politicians do not want to seem weak. So they will stick to their position, because the first one to cave in is called chicken. Right? And it was glamorized in this movie Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean. And of course, you can see that in a game like chicken, if you can show to the other person, you can signal to the other person that you are crazy, things might change. So, for example, just before getting into a car, which are two cars are driving towards each other, if one doesn't swerve, they're going to have a crash, right? So just before getting into the car, you show the other player, look, I've taken the steering wheel off my car. So once I start, I cannot swerve. I'm going to keep going straight. Then the other person knows I'm fighting with a madman. So I have to swerve. Okay. So chicken is another game where attitude is very important. That's why I say, swagger matters. Banno tera swagger. That's very important. And coming to the outcome of the current standoff between the government and the farmers.
Before that, the Lucknowi Nawabs.
Oh, the Pehle Aap idea is, that ties to something we also like to think of as trust. So why do we want to so that goes back to this. I have this little story with my daughter where she had a friend visiting, and usually I give the kids something to eat. So I went and offered them a chocolate, and my daughter took the first chocolate without waiting for a friend. Right, and so the later, when the friend left, obviously I went and scolded her. I say, "What the heck? I mean, you should let your friend choose first." So where is this pehle aap business coming from? Why do we have to be polite to our guest? Because strictly speaking, if we want to be efficient, as economists like to be, remember, you said we talked about earlier that we don't care about fairness and equity
Yes.
and all this. We should give it to the person that's hungriest. And in fact, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it's pretty stupid to offer something to the guest, because I'm teaching my daughter not to be going for survival of the fittest. If you see food, evolution says grab food. Don't leave anything for the other person. But when might you want to do that? You might want to do that if you're trying to impress somebody, like going out on a date. You want to be on your best behavior. You want to show the other person something nice. So if you're trying to start a new business relationship, or if you're trying to impress somebody, what do? You say pehle aap. Okay, that's the idea. So now you can say, okay, then why? Some people say this is cultural, or some people say it's religion, right? Atithi devo bhava. Why do we do that? Well, the reason we do this, if we make it a part of our culture and tradition, it's to fight against that evolutionary pressure, because the temptation to grab things is always there. However, if we say, God has told us not to do that, or it is in our culture, right, that we should not take the first place, it's like a commitment device. So it's like using an alarm clock to get up. So that prevents you from oversleeping. Of course, some people will hit the snooze button. Right? Or it's like that Julius is a story of crossing the Rubicon, right? Or the story of that, if you want your soldiers to fight to the last, once you cross the bridge, you burn the bridge. There's no going back. So if you make it religious, people, in their fear of offending God, will offer it to Atithi first. That's the idea.
Right. And then the farmer government
Oh, yeah.
negotiations.
So that's a hard one to predict, because of course from the government side, once they have made this decision, it's always hard to back up. On top of that, we are in the midst of a pandemic. Things are not normal. I mean, I think today I saw Abhijit Banerjee has written something that maybe we should temporarily postpone this thing till we are in normal times and have this debate. So I personally think it's hard to predict, and my personal take on those laws are that some of those laws are, I think, reasonable, and there is also the fact that I think we do need to overhaul the laws, but maybe we need to spend a little more time. So my guess is there will be some kind of a compromise solution in the end, which is not going to be covered by the game of chicken, which will allow everyone to show face a little bit. And so these protests will drag on for some time, but there will be a compromise solution, is what I would guess. There will be a revisiting of the precise details of the law. But I think in the end, the spirit will happen. That is, new laws will go through, but the content will shift. That's my prediction.
So what sort of an equilibrium is that? Game
So
theory wise.
game theory wise. So game theory wise, I would say that is a different game, because when this one, what will happen when this one gets over, I can also tell you what will happen when this. So chicken has two equilibria, right? Where one of the two players surrenders and the other one says, I didn't surrender. So we know when these types of things happen, what happens in the end? Both players claim they won.
Yeah.
They will claim that, oh, you see, they
Yeah.
surrendered because they've agreed to renegotiate. And so the farmers will claim that they surrendered because they are willing to renegotiate. The government will claim that, look, we are getting the laws through, so they surrendered. So the truth is, neither of these things actually happened, but it allows both sides to claim that they are in the equilibrium that allowed them to win. So the game changed. I will argue that, the structure of the game and the nature of the game changed because it was no longer a one-shot game. We made it a multi-round game now, which is so. The analysis of one game is going to be different if you change the game in between. The answer will be different, right? So playing prisoner's dilemma multiple times, or that doesn't change actually unless you have a repeated infinite horizon game. But there are many games where the outcome can change depending on whether you're playing it once or multiple times.
Right. Before we end, I thought I'll also ask you to talk about the Cobra effect and how that, brings out the whole incentives problem in economics. Because, again, that gives lots of insights into how policymakers are trying to do something, but everything goes completely wrong.
Yes. So many times incentives have unintended consequences, or there are second order effects that we don't realize. I mean, it's not true that even if we thought very hard, many times we would not be able to figure this out unless you implement the policy, which is why there's the rise of this whole branch of economics that deals with randomized controlled trials. That is, before we roll out a policy on a large scale, different policies to catch these unintended effects. So what was the Cobra effect? So the story was that sometime in when the British were ruling Delhi and most of India at that point in the 1800s, there were lots of cobras in Delhi. Okay, and they decided, they can't deal with so many cobras, so they will pay people to bring them a dead cobra. Okay, of course, this is the land of jugaad. So what do the Indians do? They start rearing cobras. So you start keeping snakes at home. Then you can kill one and take it to the British government and say, look, here is another dead snake. Give me money, right? So this is called the Cobra effect. It was coined by a German economist called Horst Seibert. Now, we don't know if the British and the Cobra story in India is true or not, but it was definitely true for rats in Vietnam and the French government.
And
And
the
there is a book
policymakers
on
have.
this.
Sorry, I'm saying that the policymakers have actually ended up creating a situation which is exactly opposite of what they intended to do. Instead of fewer cobras, there are now going to be a larger number of cobras or rats.
Yes. So in Vietnam, this actually happened. So there is documented evidence that people started keeping rats at home, and that might be easier, that a little bit maybe than rearing a snake at home. Keeping a snake at home may be a little more dangerous, but certainly you can imagine people keeping rats in the house and then killing some and saying, okay, now give me the money. And the observation that I made in the very beginning of this chapter is about what happened in Sudan in the height of the civil war, right? So there is this organization from Switzerland which comes and offers money to. So this is a religiously motivated conflict. So Christians that lost were being made slaves by Muslims, and so this organization started offering money to free up people from slavery. Guess what? Suddenly you found more slaves because they realized that this is a rich organization from Switzerland which is willing to pay money to free people from slavery. Suddenly you saw more slaves, and there are even reports that some of this was collusion. People who, it's like a little bit like saying Santa and Banta gang up together and go and tell the Swiss authority, look, Santa says, look, this is my slave, free him. And then later they go and split the proceeds. So these things can happen a lot. I mean, we talked about what happens with seatbelts. That was another unintended consequence. So these things do happen. We have to be careful.
Right. So thank you so much for talking to me about your book. This has been most interesting conversation. I hope I wish you all the best for your book.
Thank you, Puja. I mean, it was fun. I must say I enjoyed writing this book, and this is a wonderful chat. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about economics and the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.